this is the next best series podcast, and I'm Giovanni Lago, and I'm joined by Carlos Rosario, the costume designer of Shōgun. Thank you so much for stepping in with us today.
Of course, thank you for having me, Giovanni. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. There's so much to talk about. I think Shōgun is an exemplary series of just immersing audiences through every level of technical design, the production design, the costuming, every single aspect. So I'm very curious how you got into the project because I heard this production of this series has been very interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was contacted by a producer that I've worked with a long time ago when on my first job as an assistant designer on Three Kings. And we always stayed in touch. We always tried to work together, but it never happened until this one. And so I think it was about early 2021 when he sent me an email and asked me if, he told me a little bit about it. It was literally 2 lines: Feudal Japan, 10 episodes. It's called Shōgun. Are you interested in interviewing? And so I went for it, and I had 3 interviews with him and Justin Marks, our showrunner. In the beginning, when I read the script for the first time, I didn't really connect with the characters, but I fell in love with the period. And so I did a lot of research about that period before I met with them. And so I had about 3 interviews before they gave me the job. And so that was about in February 2021. And I started, I think, like I think about May 1st, 2021 was my first day on Shogun in Vancouver.
I would love to learn more about the research process. It's definitely like 17th century Japan. There's so much in terms of historical like books and history that you can scroll through and navigate and pull from what would inspire you. Did you find that incredibly helpful? Did you find it a bit daunting to have to lean towards exact detailing to, of course, accuracy, or did you feel that it gave you leeway to go and create more of like what you wanted to do?
No, I think it's very exciting when somebody tells you that actually, you need to be as accurate as
Mhm.
possible. Then you need to do your homework, you need to do your research. And that's actually really exciting because we live, in a world in which it's all about productivity and quantity. And, sometimes, quality is sacrificed for quantity. And so it was really exciting to work with people and with the studio, with showrunners and with producers and with a team of people that really were focusing on all the details to make sure that we would get it right, and it was about respecting the Japanese culture, the Japanese aesthetic, our Japanese actors too. And, that's really what was really exciting actually as a costume designer to have that possibility to be able to really dive into all the different layers of, the language of the clothing of that period and really do as much research as possible to be able to be as accurate as possible,
You mentioned quantity. Quantity is an understatement for this series when you're designing for so many of the lords, their clans, the servants. That doesn't even include the armor that comes in for the set piece. So in terms of that, what would you say in quantity? How did you break this down with your whole costuming team of like how did you tackle what first?
Well, I think we had to start with the armors
Mhm.
first because I had to put them into manufacturing as soon as possible in order to have enough time to have at least the Green Army ready by the first day of shooting, which was September 22nd in Tofino and of 2021. And so the first 6 weeks, pretty much, I spent all my time. I had 5 illustrators and we were doing drawings day and night, 7 days a week for like 6 weeks, all the drawings, all the research for the armors, and then once the drawings were sort of, finalized and they went through the showrunner and the experts of this period, and we got them approved, then after that, we had to take every single armor and do, very specific boards with all the different details that were part of that armor so we could send them to the manufacturing companies so they could have all the information ready to have them to start the manufacturing. and to have them ready for the first day of shooting. So in 6 weeks, pretty much we had meetings with the showrunners every week. We did lots of drawings. I met with, the director of that episode many times, with the studio, with Frederick Quince, who was our, main expert in this period. And so he's the one that looked at all the armors and gave us the green light. And except for, I think, the sleeves on the Ashigaros of the Brown Army, of Toranaga's army, there wasn't really much to change. And so that was really the most important thing, the armors. Then once we put that in the works, then we focused on all the other characters. So think, because it's a very big show, the way to sort of you have to be very structured and very specific about the different groups of people that you have to design. So it makes it easy for all the people working for me. And so the way I started designing the show was pretty much with creating groups, the people in Ajiro, the people in Osaka, and then the nobles, right? And within those different categories, then I created different color palettes. And then, I started studying, the language of the clothing of that period, and understanding that every rank had their own specifics. And, so I got closer and closer to the characters. And, that's when I really started sort of dissecting who they are and getting into more in depth into the costumes of each one of the main characters, right? But I started from the big picture first.
It's so fascinating, you're talking about in the beginning when you're reading the scripts, you're like, it's good. But like on a level, you're not connecting it. And then through the work itself, it's like clicking for you. You're like, wow, okay, like I get it. It makes sense. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the research really helped me fall in love with all these characters, because I feel like we started first studying all the paintings of that period,
Mhm.
because at the end of the day, that really is the source of, what that period was about. And I didn't want to go through, any interpretation of any Japanese
Yeah.
movies. I didn't want to see it through the filter of a Japanese director or a Japanese costume designer. So we went through directly to the Japanese paintings, and we studied the patterns and the colors, and that really helped me to fall in love with that period, and after that with the characters themselves.
So it's through because you said you just lean more towards the painting side. Did you not go back and watch or try to find the original 80s miniseries?
You I did watch a couple of clips,
Okay.
yes. And actually, what we did is that we created boards with
Hmm.
all the outfits that every single one of those characters in the 80s miniseries was wearing, right? But it wasn't really to be guided by the aesthetic of that show. It was more about understanding, well, for that location, that character with that rank was wearing a defuku or a sodenashi. It was more about, on a technical level, what kind of clothing they were wearing, but not on a creative aesthetic level, 80s, it was beautiful for that
Hmm.
period, but the 80s was a very specific,
Yeah.
aesthetic.
Hmm.
And I honestly didn't really, took that as a reference. I think that this show was very different, and I knew that since the beginning. And so I didn't really focus on that. And the same thing for the book. I really wanted to start from a really wide canvas and let this project, have its own spirit,
Yeah.
its own voice.
Totally. Well, you mentioned the 80s the show. Toshiro Mifune, like one of the greatest like screen presences ever in cinema. World cinema,
Yeah.
anyone who stepped in front of a camera. Now we have the great Hiroyuki Sanada, unbelievably underrated actor who I'm so happy has gotten the chance to, front and center in the series. And he's been attached to the project so long. And I would love to know, because I want to get into the actors. What was it like working with Hiroyuki Sanada, not just as a performer and discussing, what I need from the clothing, but more so as his role as a producer in the series.
Well, I mean, I think I met with Hiroyuki, with Mr. Sanada before we started shooting, obviously, via Zoom, right?
Mhm.
And so I could see very easily, very fast, that actually it was very important for him as an actor and as a producer to make it look as authentic and as accurate as possible. Obviously, he was, the lead character on this big show. It's, a lot of our actors actually didn't even speak English. So we needed to have translators everywhere. Some of them didn't even work outside Japan.
Mhm.
So for him, it was very important that because I am not Japanese and I've never designed any projects that are Japanese that require Japanese clothing, it was very important for him to make sure that I would do my research, that I would follow the guidance of all the experts. And then, and that's what we did from the beginning to the end, but that's also part of my job no matter what. So we did research from the beginning to the end. And, we were really in touch with all the experts and the consultants the entire time. And I have to say that Hiroyuki, Mr. Sanada, was very hands-on in everything, during the fittings, just giving me some guidance on, what kind of outfit he would prefer to wear for that specific scene, because he knew that aesthetically, creatively, we were in a good place. I think that everybody was very pleased since the beginning of what we were creating. But it's still for specific scenes, he was very clear about what he wanted to wear. So, and then also the way he would wear the clothes and also the way all the people would be dressed, right? So for him, it was very important that not only the creative aspect would be respected, but also the technical aspect would be respected. So we honor the Japanese aesthetic as much as possible.
I think the work of great costuming, whether in film or television, is to be able to convey characters' emotions, feelings through what they are wearing. A big aspect of the story is John Blackthorne. Cosmo Jarvis is great. Fish out of water, he's coming into this area. He's an outsider. I would love to pick your brain about how his costuming slowly evolves throughout the show. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. We're currently up to episode 6 at the time of this recording. Just from being very much in a prisoner to where it starts stepping up and conveying his clothing compared to everyone else's.
Yeah. So for him, I think he was, it's interesting because Cosmo Jarvis, Blackthorn, Mariko, and Toranaga, throughout the 10 episodes, they all have really a very clear evolution, right, in their characters. But the evolution is very different for the three of them. And for Cosmo, for Blackthorn, it was very clear that once they remove his, sort of English, his breeches and his blouses, it was a way to remove his identity, his connection with Europe. And then they dress him in a very simple kosode. The kosode is the ancestor to the kimono, and it's very basic. And that was really great because it really gave me the opportunity to slowly, as his character is emerge into the Japanese culture. And he is more and more part of the dynamics between all the different characters. I could add more and more Japanese, clothing pieces, right? And it was really interesting because I could see that, they're obviously very different from breeches and a blouse. And so, you have to tie them in a very specific way. And so I could see that he would then start walking in a different way, speaking in a different way. And I think that really kind of was sort of an immersive experience for the character, right? It wasn't just the land, it wasn't just the people around him, but also the clothing. And so we started with something very basic, and I started adding and adding more Japanese clothing pieces up to the point where we actually even see him with the katagino, which is very formal, right? And so that's later on in later episodes. And so it was really interesting to just kind of like go through all that evolution in his clothing. And for in terms of the color palette, as you can see, it's very different from the color palette that of the Blackthorn that Richard Chamberlain portrayed in the
Mhm.
in the miniseries in the 80s. I wanted to make sure that his colors were going to be very muted, very neutral, very masculine in a way. Um, but without patterns, very simple, because in a way, he's a very powerless character, within the dynamic of everybody. I mean, he's the foreigner that just suddenly finds himself in the middle of all this power dynamics between all these lords. And so I didn't want him to, steal too much the show. You know,
Mhm.
I wanted him to stay neutral, to make him look powerless, and at the same time, it kind of allowed him to always be in contrast with everybody else. You know,
Yeah.
his clothing is are so simple that they contrast with the luxurious fabrics of all the other characters
Yeah.
around him.
I that's something I just noticed immediately. The costuming is so intricate and so beautifully well done, and then you see John Blackthorne, and it's the most simple of robes. And
Mhm.
I think also through the costuming, it helps the intentional comedy, the moments of levity the show tries to do, especially through Cosmo Jarvis's character.
Totally.
So I think that's just incredibly well done. Another
Yeah.
character that's very tied to John Blackthorne is Lady Mariko, played by the great Anna Sawai. I would love to learn more about the costuming, the choices that went into her costuming.
So I think for Mariko is very different. It's a different evolution. This was more, I tried throughout the entire project to be, like we said, as accurate and as authentic as I could. But for Mariko, she's a little bit the heart of the project in a way. And so it was important for me to be authentic and accurate, but at the same time, I needed to bring into her costumes sort of more of an emotional, psychological aspect because she goes through such a big emotional arc from the first episode to the last one that it was important for me to show it through the costumes. And actually, it's interesting because I read on YouTube a few days ago somebody that was sharing her opinion about the costumes, and she said something like, "Well, we could mute the volume and look at the characters and look at the costumes and know what they're going through, and that is really the best compliment that you can give a costume designer." And that was my intention for Mariko. So basically, for her the first time that Buntaro meets her, he describes her as being very icy because of everything that happened to her previously, right? And we learn a little bit about it in episode 6. And so she's been dishonored, her family has been dishonored. She's sort of walking in life, without a spirit, lifeless. And I wanted to portray that in her costumes. So for me, it was about representing winter through her costumes, and that's why it's very monochromatic. The first uchikake that she wears, which is the top layer, has a very, specific pattern, and that pattern is basically represents snow covering the grass. So to me, it really helped me to tell the story of where she starts, but it also was a way to create a white canvas so I could incorporate elements that would describe the new Mariko as the episodes progress, right? And so slowly what I did is that I incorporated within those very monochromatic, white, snowy, lifeless sort of costumes, the small camellias, as she finds her voice, as she finds her path, as she finds, her purpose, we could see that life sort of starts to come through in her costumes. And, up to the point where actually there are more patterns and more embroidery and more colors in her costumes later on in the later episodes. But also there's one thing that is very interesting about Mariko is that I decided to bring the white outfits back in the later episodes for several reasons. One, because white is the color of death in Japanese culture. When they commit seppuku, they have to wear sort of like a white, kosore, white hakama pants, whatever. And so she knows as the storyline progresses that death is around the corner. But also there is another reason is that empowerment is not linear, and so it comes with doubts. It comes with fears. And I thought it was important to bring the white back, which is the Mariko from the beginning, so we could see that it's also a struggle for her to go through this evolution. And so it was my way of saying empowerment is not linear. It's just not a straight line.
Wow. Avoiding spoilers, but there's plenty of death in the series. And the large scale fighting sequences. In terms of the costuming, you mentioned earlier the difficulty in terms of like breaking down the parts and giving it detailing. Did when it came to the conversations about the stunts and actors performing those fight sequences, how did that play into designing the costume? Did that give any difficulties of like, oh, we had this really good design here, and then while they're testing it out, you're like, you have to go back and redo it. Did any of that ever happen?
Well, I mean, I think that, stunts action always impact the costumes in the sense that you need to create multiples. So in that sense, I was a little bit restricted for certain costumes in terms of the fabrics.
Mhm.
All the fabrics are coming from Japan because I really wanted to make sure that, I mean, those fabrics really capture the essence of the Japanese, culture and aesthetic. So pretty much all the fabrics are coming from Japan, but they come in bolts of like 10, 11 meters, and they're one of a kind. So when you have multiples that you need to create, multiple costumes of the same costume for the action, for the stunts and all that, I mean, at the end of the day, the fabric that you're able to find is really what determines how creative you can get with the costumes, basically. So that was one aspect that, was a bit challenging because, of course, sometimes you need to play outside the boundaries of the period because you are restricted by the fabric that you find. But, if there was one thing that really was very clear to me in terms of how I needed to change the costumes for stunts was in terms of the armors
Mm.
because I wanted those armors to be as light as possible. I knew our actors were going to be wearing those armors for hours and hours and hours and days. And, they can get very heavy, and most of the armors that I've seen were extremely heavy. And so I decided not to do them in iron. I decided to do them in leather. And so I made all the armors. Of course, they have certain pieces that are in rubber because of the action, right, for safety. But a lot of the pieces, the chest plates, are in leather, mostly because of the lightness, but also because the leather breaks down really well. And I thought it would give a very nice breakdown to the costume, right? So at the end of the day, when I put the armor on top of on Mr. Sanada, he was very excited, and he said to me that that was the lightest armor he has ever worn in his career. So that was a really a nice compliment.
Wow. Real quick, because we're gonna have to start wrapping up. Unfortunately, I could talk to you about this for hours. We talked about Japan, the importance of it being shown in this beautiful manner and an accurate portrayal. Japan is easily as big as a character in this series in the setting as you know Toranaga or John Blackthorne. Did the environments that you saw they were shooting at ever play into the colors that you were designing for the costuming that you wanted to play off? So like when it's captured on camera, like it's just perfect.
Well, I mean, I think that, yes, the color palette in this project was very, very important. Actually, it was when I read the script for the first time. The two words that came to mind right away was colors and textures. But I think the colors were mostly guided by the novel in the sense that James Clavell describes the Gray Army, Ishido's army as the Gray Army, and Toranaga's army as the Brown Army. And in the first script, they kept that. So I wanted to honor James Clavell, and I wanted to make sure that we would respect his vision by going in that direction. So as you can see, all the different army are in very specific colors. And so my idea is that, well, if those armies are in this color, then by extension, their lords, their leaders should follow the same color palette, right? So that really is pretty much where I started in terms of the colors, right? And so after that, every single character, every single lord, every single army is pretty much a little bit in alignment with natural elements, with elements from nature that I got inspired by, and that really was sort of my first guidance, and that was really great because it really created very strong containers of what my possibilities were for every army and every character and every lord, right? And so that really kind of simplified everything. You know, it really gave me very clear boundaries. After that, I mean, I knew that the project visually was going to be a little bit dark and gritty, you know? So everything has been overdyed, everything has been broken down. And so after that, what happens with the filters and with the director of photographies and, you know, their conversations with the showrunners, it's up to them to really then change the visuals the way they want. But we did a lot of camera tests in the beginning, so I had a good sense of where it was going.
That's This is fascinating. I like can listen to this all day. I think Shogun is one of the best TV shows in recent memory that conveys scale, you know, this grandeur, something like the people have compared it to like Game of Thrones. I think it's apt in terms of what everyone
Yeah.
in this series, on camera, behind the camera, has done. Thank you so much for being here today. This is amazing. And real quickly, is there anything else you're working on or coming out soon or
Yeah, so I actually have the new Alien movie coming out in
Romulus?
August.
Okay.
Alien
Oh,
Romulus.
what a
Very
stark
different.
contrast. Yeah, going from Japan to sci-fi. Wow.
Very
Okay.
different. Equally as fun, very different to design, but that's going to be a great project too. I think it comes out mid-August. Yeah.
Yeah, that trailer that just came out was amazing. Thank you so much, Carlos. This was amazing.
Thank you for having me. Of course, thank you.